You know, earlier this year, the Independent Office of Evaluation benefited from an external peer review of the evaluation function at IFAD. This review put on the table 8 recommendations to further enhance the evaluation function. Today, we are here to discuss and pave the way forward to the implementation of the first recommendation, namely the revision of the evaluation policy so that it focuses more on strategic issues, provides greater institutional value, and establishes clear roles and responsibilities across the evaluation value chain. Now, to give us a bit of context and before kicking off with the panel discussion, may I ask Oscar Garcia, the Director of Independent Office of Evaluation, to just provide a short remarks. Oscar?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roxy. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you here today. And I want to thank particularly the ones who were in the morning with us to keep on participating in IOE events. But we wanted to take benefit of the presence of Alison Evans. Alison is a known person in the field of evaluation and development in general. As you know, she had very important and prominent responsibilities in her home country, the UK, spearheading the efforts to keep government accountable through the Commission for the Parliament, and also contributing to the development thinking by heading one of the most influential think tanks in the UK, which is ODI. And now she's heading the Independent Evaluation Group, which, as you know, encompasses all the members of the evaluation of the World Bank Group, including IFC and IDA and IBRD, and MIGA as well. So that's why I'm also extremely helpful to have Donald and Paul, 2 of our associate vice presidents who interact more directly with IOE. Once we want to revamp and strengthen even further the evaluation function at IFAD. And we thought that it was a timely opportunity to have this internal discussion. Why do I call it internal? Because we did not invite member states, because we are more in a dialogue with questions, trying to answer to those questions and trying to do it in a very constructive manner. There is some background. As you know, the evaluation function in IFAD is not new. It really evolved from 1978 to the way we see it today. And this evolution was, I would say, an accumulation of experiences and lessons learned that have moved the evaluation function even further to position it nowadays as a reference in the multilateral development system, for sure among the United Nations Evaluation Group, and as well as the Evaluation Cooperation Group of the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. In this evolution, we have had 2 iterations of the evaluation policy before, one in 2003 and the other one in 2011. The one of 2011 was also the result of an external peer review, the first to which IFAD participated as part of the Evaluation Cooperation Group. And it, of course, was an opportunity to strengthen areas that needed to be strengthened. What I mean is that we're not starting from scratch, and we continue evolving and adapting the evaluation function to the current times and the current development challenges that IFAD as an organization is facing, but the overall international development community is facing in addressing now the very ambitious sustainable development goals. And we thought that it was a good opportunity to stop and reflect. Roxy has prepared a very elaborate set of questions to all of us. I don't know to what extent we will follow those, because, you know, we are free thinkers, right? And as such, the dynamics of our interaction may lead us in unexpected directions. However, before we get into that, I would like to say that for us, an evaluation policy, as a normative body, has been extremely important in guiding the evaluation function in clarifying responsibilities between management, the board, and the independent office of evaluation, and in protecting also the evaluation function. Institutions are made by people, but the nature of our institutions is that people move, and that they are here today and may not be here tomorrow. However, we construct and we build institutional strengths. And I think this is an opportunity to seize the recommendation from the external peer review of the evaluation function to strengthen even further that institutionality, right? So that we can really set the norms for the next generation of interactions between the executive board, between IFAD management and the independent office of evaluation in such a way that really strengthens three of the principles of any evaluation function, which are its credibility, that whatever we say is credible, that is done professionally and done according to the highest standards of international cooperation in that arena, that what we are saying is independent, and by that we say it is free of undue pressure for getting X or Y results, and most importantly, that it is useful, that an evaluation function is useful for improving the quality of decision making, but also useful for helping IFAD to fulfill its mandate, right, in the context of the SDGs, which, as I said, are very ambitious, but at the same time are very necessary, right? That ambition level is necessary, and that should drive us into a reflective mode to see what is needed to really achieve what we and member states have agreed to achieve until 2030. Thank you, Roxy.
Thank you, Oscar, and thank you for setting the parameters for the panel discussion. Now, this afternoon we have the privilege of having four knowledgeable colleagues who will be talking on this issue. And I ask you to keep your responses to 3 minutes, and then we'll come to the floor for questions and comments. Let me kick us off by giving the floor to Alison Evans. Alison, as Oscar mentioned, is the Director General and the Senior Vice President of the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. She assumed this role in January of this year and brings more than 25 years of development experience, having worked both for multilateral and development and bilateral and multilateral development agencies. Now, Alison, in preparing for this panel discussion, I discovered that the bank does not have an evaluation policy. What you have is principles of evaluation. So if you could just share with us how these principles of evaluations are contributing to build a culture of results, and tell us whether the lack of an evaluation policy has hindered the bank's effectiveness.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to do this. It's nice to be able to share and reflect, and hopefully this will be an interesting conversation to inform the next stages of thinking about the evaluation policy in IFAD. It's not quite accurate to say we don't have an evaluation policy. We do in everything but name. This document, which was finally published in April this year, the World Bank Group Evaluation Principles, is the first document of its kind within the World Bank Group that actually sets out the commitment across the whole evaluation ecosystem, if you like, to the core principles of credibility, independence, utility. It does actually have a directive attached to it. So it does sit alongside policies within the World Bank, but it doesn't have the title of evaluation policy. And there are interesting reasons why that is the case, not particularly ones I'm going to share here, but needless to say, I think this document does many of the things that the evaluation policies of other organizations does. And let me just outline a few of those things before I answer your question of, do we need it, in a sense? And what difference does it make? So the first thing to say is that the production of this document was also in response to an external review that was undertaken in 2015 of the Independent Evaluation Group inside the World Bank. And the recommendation, to quote from that external review, was to translate international evaluation principles, good practice standards into a framework relevant to the World Bank Group's mandate, system of governance, and operating environment. And this document essentially does that, and for the first time, actually, as I said, establishes a set of common principles that apply to evaluation across the entire institution. And very similar in many ways to other evaluation policies, in addition to the core principles of utility, credibility, and independence, it situates the contribution that evaluation makes to accountability and learning in the context of the World Bank Group's strategic priorities. It sets out the institutional arrangements and roles and responsibilities with respect to evaluation, all the way down from the Committee on Development Effectiveness, which is the Bank Board's committee, to which I particularly report, through management, through operational units, to the role of IEG, but also how that's situated in relation to other partners, country clients, and the wider public. So for the first time, it tries to describe the universe within which evaluation is situated and the institutional arrangements for its governance and its management and take-up. It also, interestingly, which is very relevant in the bank context specifically, situates evaluation within the nexus of research on the one hand and monitoring and oversight on the other. Or maybe I should put oversight, audit, and then monitoring. So it also situates evaluation and the contribution it makes relative to these other areas of engagement. And that I think was a particularly interesting contribution internally. So what was it like before this document? Because it's kind of late in the day. IEG's been around a very long time, and evaluation has been around a very long time. And why only in 2019 now have we really put this together? Well, I don't have all the backstory to that because I've only been in this job since January. But what I would say is that the principles, the core evaluation principles that form the spine of this particular document were actually very well established in IEG. And actually were very well established across the mandatory self-evaluation system. But where they weren't particularly well established or even known was in the whole universe of other forms of evaluation that is undertaken in the World Bank. And there has been an explosion of other forms of evaluation in the last decade. So forms of evaluation linked, for example, to the requirements of trust funds that is undertaken purely for the purpose of the funder, but doesn't come through IEG and isn't necessarily always adhering to those core essential principles. The huge amount of different forms of impact evaluation, ex ante, particularly impact evaluation that takes place now in the World Bank. The role of DIME, some of you may have heard of DIME and of other impact evaluation labs, of which we have a significant number. These were not necessarily pulled together as part of a wider ecosystem of evaluation, and the principles, which have tended to go hand in hand with ex post and independent evaluation, were not principles that were necessarily, although they were probably adhered to in practice, but at least spoken about in that community. So what's different? Well, what's different in a way is having a level playing field, a common framing of core principles, and a very useful description, if you like, of this ecosystem. And all of those things are very useful contributions of this particular document. I would say it took 2.5 years to negotiate this document inside the World Bank, which says a lot about the competing interests and different sort of world views that operate in different parts of the World Bank Group. If you do nothing else, please don't spend 2.5 years on revising evaluation policy. As the new incoming DGE, would I feel lost without this? It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I would, frankly. I think it's a very useful scaffolding. I think it protects us against the negative in a way. Where there's potential for a kind of loss of commitment to those core principles, which should be universal and well understood and adhered to. Where there is potential for confusion around institutional arrangements, around who reports where, who is responsible for what, I think it protects us against the erosion of some of those sort of values and principles. But does it really provide a positive platform for really adding value to the World Bank Group through evaluation? I'm not entirely sure this is the springboard for that. So maybe I can talk a little bit more about why I think about that in the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Alison. Paul is really jumping at the bits because he wants to ask a question, but just hold that for a minute, Paul. Thank you very much, and thank you for your very honest response. I love your metaphor of scaffolding. And yeah. Now, our next panelist is Donald Brown. He is the Associate Vice President for Program Management Department. So, sir, your department is the beneficiary of the evaluation process and at the same time the evaluant. Tell us, what are some of the obstacles that you've encountered in internalizing the evaluation findings and recommendations that you have received? And how has this, if it has, hindered you and your department to be able to deliver better results?
Thank you. So maybe just 3 things in terms of how it's hindered us or how we could maybe do it better. One, I think there's an issue of relevance in terms of the selection of the evaluations and sometimes the type of evaluation product that we've had. I think the peer review was fairly clear that we needed a more sort of a developed, different mix of products, and I think we would probably very much agree with that. So that they could be more, sometimes faster, quicker and dirtier, but more relevant and more useful. But also sometimes I think some of the evaluations and the themes aren't necessarily the highest priority or the most important one, where there are other product or other themes that we would have said was probably higher priority and value. I think the second point, and a little bit linked to this, is the timeliness of the evaluations. You know, the world doesn't stop, and we're often designing a next phase of a program or a new country strategy now, and particularly on the programmatic side of things and the projects. So to really be able to learn and absorb the lessons, we need them now, because often if they come sort of 2 or 3 years into a new project, it's too late for us. Particularly as we have a lot of partners, not only government, but we do more and more on a co-financing side. So there's an issue of timeliness, you know, which to me goes back to the product. Sometimes a less finessed product that could happen earlier may be more use in terms of lesson learning and getting stuff. And then I think the last point is really about flexibility of the evaluation process. I think the actual process of evaluation and the sort of interaction engagement on the evaluation can be as beneficial, sometimes maybe more beneficial than the final product. So I think the more you can, you know, you have that flexibility within an evaluation that you can really engage and really talk about and interact early on. I think everything I've said, I totally put within the kind of context of the independence of the Independent Office of Evaluation in IFAD. But for me, independence doesn't mean you can't engage more and have more of an interaction. And I think there could be more flexibility in the process of evaluation that could actually end up with a better product. So there would be my three points to your question.
Thank you for that. Paul, and then after you give your answer, you can ask Alison your question, which then Alison can answer later on. Now, Donald highlighted the obstacles about the evaluation, some of the obstacles that his department is facing, and it's more about the evaluation function. But I was just wondering, in the new KM strategy, what are some of the things that you guys have put out there that can help internalize, the learning and the recommendations, and so that these things are implemented and acted upon rather than just sitting on a shelf?
Great. So I liked what Alison said about how evaluation fits in with research and M&E. So when you're trying to get evidence into a project and use it operationally, you need the combination of evidence from different sources. And so evaluation clearly plays part of that role, but it's the overall package, what's being said out there in the world and the research community about what works, what's come out of impact evaluation, other things, what's being said in the M&E system that's coming out of the project. Is implementation working? Are you making the steps that are necessary and going in the direction towards an impact? And so evaluation fits in there nicely, but you need to really pull that all together. And so the strategy that we're trying to come up with is trying to pull that together in different ways. And there's the obvious things about publications and collecting those lessons into how-to notes like we have here. What we're hoping to do though is turn those into live notes, and in fact be online in which that information is available, and that would bring together the evaluation information along with the other information, so that people who are doing a livestock project can go and get to the up-to-date information on what's being learned on that. We're also hoping to try to use more communities of practice that are linked to these, in which the best practices, including coming out of evaluation, are being brought together. In doing all that, and a lot of what I'm getting to is the timeliness of information, and this is partly what Donald was just saying, is information needs to be timely, and part of the utility of something is whether it's done at the right time. So my own view is by far the most valuable, both from IEG, from my history of looking at the reports, and from IOE, has been thematic reviews. And part of it is because they bring together the lessons of an institution in a thematic area. If they're done well, they also bring lessons from the outside into a thematic area. And there's been a few really good ones from both IAG and IOE that have done this. And they feed naturally into the kind of the knowledge strategy, knowledge agenda, because they're pulling it together for you. So I think that's a key part of the strategy. What I wanted to ask is about, you were talking, which I think is quite interesting, about the evaluation principles and trying to make those principles more widely understood or accepted within an institution. And I'm curious to know how well that's happened. Having come from the impact evaluation world, I know a lot of the people at DIME. And there's been this parallel world of people that do evaluations and then people that do impact evaluations and rarely talking to each other. And I think over time it's actually gotten a bit better, where it's merged a bit. And so I'm curious to know, is there some acceptance of this from both DIME, but also like the Gender Innovation Lab and other of these labs there at the World Bank? So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay, now before Alison can respond, let me just go to Oscar so that we don't lose this thought process. And so, Oscar, you heard Alison talking about, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but the utility of the principles. And Donald about the challenges that his department is facing, and Paul is setting the way forward, basically the initiation of the way forward. So my question to you is, how has the current evidence-based evaluation contributed to create a culture of results within IFAD, or has it? And if there are 3 elements that you would like to introduce in the revised policy to further enhance this, what would those be?
All right, it's a really broad question. And I think it has contributed in many ways. First, I would say by setting up an architecture that replicates the business model of the international financial institutions who provide mainly loans.
Mm-hmm.
And that architecture is based on the role that national governments play as implementers of our operations, and the responsibility that they have at the end of every IFAD finance operation to produce a project completion report. Right? A project completion report that sets very clearly how the objectives of that particular intervention were achieved or not achieved. Right? And for us, that's really the basis of first, it's the basis of the accountability and learning exercise at the project level, and the beginning of the relationship with independent evaluation, because there is where the validation process comes into play. And based on that experience at the project level, you can then start identifying trends of performance that could lead to more aggregation, either thematic or programmatic or regional and so on. But I think IFAD has done quite a lot in establishing this architecture, and I would say that it is embedded into IFAD's culture, and it has been an evolution. Now, is this architecture responding to the needs of accountability and learning? And there, the answer is a bit more mixed, right? Because yes, it has some positive elements, but there is big room for improvement, particularly in what I think is the internalization of evaluation into improving the quality of decision making. IFAD has been producing the annual report on results and impact for many years, and it is a bit frustrating to see that the topics are coming again and again. Not all the topics, because we also have seen important action being taken. For instance, regarding efficiency of our operations, we have seen that management has took very serious action on shortening the disbursement ratios and time lags, improving the preparedness for projects to start delivering, and factors that we have identified in the evaluation that we know are conducive to less positive results. And as such, there is an accumulation. At the same time, your question is, what are the three elements that I would like to perhaps highlight in the next iteration for an evaluation policy? And what we have seen in terms of the relevance of the evaluation, the timeliness of the evaluation, and the flexibility of the evaluation process, in my view, they do not correspond to an evaluation policy. Because the policy should be setting the principles and the roles and responsibilities, and not more than that. The right product mix, in my view, is something much more dynamic that should respond to the evolving needs of the organization. And the moment that we try to embed, for instance, the product mix, as it's currently the case in the evaluation policy of IFAD, we make it a bit more rigid, because then to review that, we need to review the whole evaluation policy, which sometimes may imply also reviewing the principles, which put us not, I wouldn't say at square zero, but back again into a very more difficult process. Right? And so I think it's important to separate what should be at the policy level and what should be at the operational level, so that we can have more fluid discussions about how the operation supports the principles embedded in a policy. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you for that. Alison, why don't you respond to Paul's question, and then I'll come to the floor to see if there are any questions before going for the second round.
So, one of the things I would say is that there's the reason this took two plus years, which way predates me, was that I think there was a huge amount of discussion around, to what extent were these genuinely principles, and how do we interpret them in different parts of the institution? And in the end, the feeling, of course, is that whether you're on the impact evaluation end, whether you're on the ex post independent evaluation end, you want to be credible. credibility is important. You may come at that slightly differently, but credibility, rigor, robustness, absolutely a sine qua non for evaluation. Independence, to the extent that it means freedom from, excessive bias or lack of being partial as opposed to impartial, again, is something we, frankly, as evaluators, should all agree on, whether you're a research evaluator or an ex post evaluator. I think the problem has been the interpretation of that and how that has looked in practice. And one of the unfortunate features, I think, of institutional evaluation, ex post evaluation, is that it has come over a long period of time to treat independence as putting up a rather high wall to somehow risk the antibodies of the institution infecting you somehow. And I think, quite frankly, that is a distortion of the fundamental concept there, which is actually freedom from being unduly biased towards a particular outcome from an evaluation. And I think we're a lot smarter about how we do that today. And on utility, again, we're all interested in making sure evaluation has a use value, has an audience, and the rest of it. So my sense is it's not as if all evaluators across the World Bank have been clamoring to sign up, and they have tattoos on their arms of, credibility, utility, and independence. But let's put it this way, the scope for disagreement is, I think, smaller today than it probably has been, and people recognize these are useful overarching principles for evaluation. I just thought I'd say something else in response to Oscar, if you don't mind, before we go out, that, I very much agree that it's actually, I think it's really important not to overinvest in the evaluation policy as describing all things in relation to evaluation, because we do need the flexibility to adapt and change over time. And one of the challenges I think I have with them is that it's the case that virtually every external review of every multilateral development bank independent evaluation function has come up with the same requirement for an evaluation policy. It's regarded as good standard, it's good practice, fine. But we have to be careful to avoid this being like we have a hammer and everything's a nail, that somehow we sort of box ourselves into a model of working which is actually unable to move with the organizations, the institutions that we relate to. I mean, I feel strongly that the evaluation principles, which is our nearest thing to a policy in the World Bank Group, does provide as I said, a scaffold. And I think that's useful. But that's all that it provides. And I wouldn't really want it to provide much more.
Okay, thank you for that. Questions from the floor? Yes, sir.
Thank you for the very interesting discussion, and thank you for all the panelists. My question goes to Alison, is regarding the three core principles. Sometimes, from my point of view, it seems there are some conflict between two different principles. For instance, between credibility and between utility, or between independence and utility. So from your experience, not only within the World Bank, how have you been able to explain or to overcome these kind of challenges our clients can see? It's not from the point of the evaluation, independent evaluation group, but from the client perspective. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's see if there's any, yes. And then we'll come to the panel.
Yes, just a quick question to respond. I mean, a bit of a reaction and a question. So Oscar mentioned the fact that it's somehow frustrating to see that the same issues are raised again and again. And that we had an impact on proving some issues like efficiency and not really on effectiveness or something like that. I mean, to me, that's not so surprising because efficiency is something more in our control, whereas effectiveness is the challenge of development somehow. I mean, the challenge of making sure that the interventions do the right things and are implemented effectively. So I guess my question is, I mean, how could having a more comprehensive approach, including the sorts of things that Alison and Paul were discussing in terms of research, impact evaluation, self-evaluation, how could that help us move closer towards having an improvement on not just the efficiency, but say on the effectiveness of evaluations? Thank you.
Okay, so Alison, why don't you go first and then Oscar?
Internal consistency or otherwise of the principles. I mean, I'll be entirely honest. For me, that genuinely is no conflict. If you're doing evaluation well, you would always strive for credibility, even if you're trying to be fast and timely. You would be looking for questions and approaches that allow one to be fast and timely while being credible. I mean, I think we all lose if evaluation lacks credibility, of whatever hue that evaluation comes. So the first is, and that should be in the interest of us all, including our client countries and partners, that we need it to be credible. But sometimes to be credible, we also need to manage down the scope of evaluation, because sometimes I think we can be drawn into being too ambitious. That's the first thing. On independence, like I say, this is no mystery. There are very clear ways in which you can put checks and balances in evaluation to ensure that you are as free from bias and partiality as possible. They're well established, tried and tested, and I think we have to be less caught in this kind of permanent existential worry around independence. But independence cannot mean, should not mean, and under any circumstances, isolation. And we can be independent and engaged. Now, engagement is where we start to think about the principle of utility. I'm very big on the use value of evaluation. And it seems to me that we've learned a great deal more over time about how to ensure use value, including being engaged with clients and internal and external. And understanding the kinds of questions that we then as evaluators want to interrogate that are fundamental to what makes for effectiveness, what does development effectiveness look like in practice. So I can absolutely see the tensions. People need to be aware, but actually for me, we can be flexible within while preserving the integrity of the three principles. And I think over time, you'll see that evaluation functions have, in fact, been quite flexible. And with Donald's point at the beginning, I used to say when I was running ICAI in the UK, that my own experience was that about 75% of the learning and the uptake of what we did happened during the process, not at the report stage, not at the end. And it was how we went about those evaluations that actually allowed us to have high use value. There was no question that we weren't independent, and there was no question that we were trading off credibility, but we were able to engage and get much more uptake in the here and now.
Thank you. Oscar?
Yes, thank you. I think you're right, Lauren, in terms of recognizing the importance of many streams to improve the effectiveness of the organization, right? It's not just coming from evaluation as one input to improve the quality of decision making. And in that sense, I would like to recognize the important role that plays the strategy and knowledge department into doing that. And I would like to illustrate that with an example. And I think in IFAD, the moment that SKD undertook the responsibility of conducting impact evaluation at scale is the moment that we have seen a significant and important positive quality change in our monitoring system. Right? But it was interesting that it took management to be on that leading role to recognize what IOE has been saying for many years, right? That the quality of the monitoring system was not good enough. But going forward in terms of the type of engagement and the place between evaluation in between monitoring and research, when I joined IFAD and a few years later Paul joined IFAD, it was the time of developing the new evaluation manual. And we made an effort that our definition for impact evaluation was the same. The same that was being used by SKD was the same definition that was being used by IOE. Right? And for us, that was important because that was how IFAD conducted impact evaluation. Right? And having that dialogue, in my view, has now rendered fruits in terms of the collaboration that we have with the RIA team, that nowadays, in a very significant and important shift that I would like to recognize, they are now even sharing the databases for those impact evaluations, which of course are a public good to improve the quality of our analysis and decision making. So I see that type of engagement as a very positive sign. But let me address very quickly two of the items that were raised. One is regarding the timeliness. The timeliness of evaluation is critical for its utility. We all know that. But I think when we are speaking about the principles for drafting a new evaluation policy, we should have a broader look. And the timeliness should be related to the learning process, which does not necessarily happen immediately after an evaluation has been conducted. In my experience, there are evaluations that have a longer lifetime than others. One evaluation may have its shorter lifetime, you provide the feedback, basta, that's it. Other evaluations may take 2, 3, even 4 years to render the fruits, that are contained within. Why? Because learning is related to when does an organization learn? Beyond our individual capacity of learning as individuals. In my view, an organization learns when it needs to learn. When there are pressures in the context that force it to do things differently, otherwise it put many other important things at risk. And I consider that evaluation has a contribution to learning, even as a repository of knowledge, of what has worked, what has not worked, and identifying why, the factors why it did not work. So if it's used at the end of December 2019, good. But if it's used in May 2021, it's also good. Therefore, I want to put the concept of timeliness in perspective. Of course, we want to be timely, and we want to do it quicker, right? But sometimes you need some time to really provide the lessons learned for the organization in order not to repeat the same mistakes, right? So just a contribution on that.
Okay, I actually have a follow-up question for Paul on what Oscar said. So let's say that tomorrow we have this repository of what has worked and what hasn't worked. What percentage of people do you think will actually go into that repository and proactively search for what has worked and what hasn't worked?
But I mean, this is a broader issue of whether people use evidence to make any decisions in their projects, right? And what incentives they have to do so. And if you don't change the incentives to use evidence, then people don't use it.
Sure, but in this case, the incentive is to deliver a better project, which I don't think there can be any higher incentive than this.
Yeah, except that some people don't necessarily think that evidence is the best way. It's experience that decides what's the best project. And so you use your experience to design a project rather than the evidence that's out there. I mean, you only have to look around the policies in the world to see how much of them are based on evidence. And so I do think it's an issue in that within an organization, if you want people to use evidence, whether it's from learning from the experience of that organization through either internal or external evaluation, then you really have to make sure that people are rewarded for doing that.
Okay, so what will it take us to get there?
One is when we review projects to check. Did people learn the lessons from the previous projects? Did they learn the lessons from the set of projects that have been done, from similar projects that have been done elsewhere? And to see whether they're actually bringing that evidence to bear in the decisions that they're making, right? I mean, every project is a hypothesis, right? That if I spend this money, something good will happen. You'd hope that you'd choose to spend that money in such a way that the evidence suggests that it would be the best. But, sorry to use my daughter as an example, but she works at the Inter-American Development Bank. And so she called me a couple weeks ago and asked why they were designing a certain set of projects. And I said, well, why do you think they should? And she said, oh, because the evidence shows that this isn't going to work in the health sector. And she said, well, I don't know what to tell you. That's the government wants to do it regardless of the fact that it doesn't work. The project leaders wants to do it. So it's a complicated issue. So there's there's the data, the analysis that gives you learning. Then there's the ability to make it accessible. So people have to be able to digest that. And then there's the actual use. And if you don't have all of that working, then you're not going to get it.
Okay, well, okay. Donald, how would you respond to Paul?
I would agree with Paul. But I think what I would add is I think too often we don't actually build on previous projects. So one of the things we're trying to push a lot more in an organisation like IFAD, and I look at the organisation that I came from, is too often we think, oh, well, let's do something new rather than how do we, the one thing we learn about development is a 30, 50, 100-year process. And actually, I think if we go back to learning, a lot of it is about saying, well, what do we get from the previous phase of this project? What do we build on? What do we do differently? And I think that's happening more. And so we should be taking much more of a programmatic approach to what we're doing. And it should be 4 phases. So one of my questions to people is, so you're bringing something here. What's phase 3 going to look like? You're talking about phase 1 now. Are you thinking about what phase 3 looks like? And trying to encourage people to build on what's there before, often if it's looking like it's working rather than... But, there's a lot of personal incentives here. And, you look at something, you want to do something that you're interested in, so you look at what's there. But I think that, to me, is the key thing I would add to what Paul said, is, is how do, what's 5 phases of one project look like? Because that's how you really learn and build.
Alison, you want to add something?
Yeah, I have to say that I'd written down here and highlighted in yellow that, if you were to ask me what perhaps the limitations of an evaluation policy really are, I think it's because they really don't get at incentives and behaviours in any meaningful way. And I think we could take a much more behaviourist approach to how evidence is taken up and utilised. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about in the context of the World Bank and IEG is, that I've kind of got my sights on a whole number of different constituencies who we need to think a little bit differently about each, about how they can be a user and translator of evaluative evidence. And I can't have one strategy for all of them, because actually they're, whether it's shareholders, board members, whether it's country directors or task team leaders of programs, they, in a sense, all have slightly different needs. And I think one of the problems of institutional knowledge and learning strategies is they often assume that everybody's doing it in the same way. And that can be problematic. I also think we have a slight problem, which is that I, in self-reflection mode, would say that as evaluators, I would challenge us in terms of the quality of the lessons we produce. I think a lot of what we produce ends up being a little generic, actually. And I think we could be a lot more demanding on ourselves to generate truly useful, value-adding kinds of lessons. And it's not as easy as it sounds, actually. But to go to your point, Lauren, why are we hearing, Oscar was saying, and you were reflecting, why are we hearing the same things? Well, to some extent, we're hearing the same things because we're reproducing the same kinds of lessons. I don't know how useful that is. So I think we've got to challenge ourselves quite a lot on that as evaluators and across the ecosystem, actually.
So let me ask you a follow-up question. So how would you go about putting in place something whereby the quality of the lessons are like of value, as you said, value added? And then also something that you mentioned earlier about the need to adapt and change. So, if you were to give a word of counsel on both issues, just share your thoughts with us.
Well, I think one of I don't have all the answers here. We're all struggling with the same sorts of things, so I need to be quite humble. But I would say around lesson learning, I think there's a tension, and I don't know if you recognize this tension, between the fact that the project or the intervention is the unit of account around which a lot of our evaluation system is based. But the lessons are not necessarily specific to the project. And therefore, we're missing sometimes, the ability to get traction on a whole set of really important drivers of good practice that don't simply or exclusively or even ever reside within the project itself. And I think that's a real challenge. So in a way, one of the bits of counsel is let's find ways to kind of move beyond, if you like, move up the value chain in terms of lesson learning. One of the things we're trying to pivot back to in IEG in the World Bank is the programmatic and the country level, because it feels like we slightly lost a grip. In our desire to go thematic, we've kind of lost sight of the country as a unit of engagement for the World Bank Group. Equally, all of our evaluation, our self-evaluation system is completely focused around the project level or the policy loan. And it's quite difficult to then add up lessons meaningfully to the country level. So we're trying to repopulate that part of our understanding of what works in what ways and why, because it seems that we can provide a more holistic approach to lessons and hopefully be a little less generic.
Right.
So when I speak to country directors in the bank, one of the complaints they have, they say, well, the evaluation was really useful, but actually what I take away from it isn't really changing my mind massively. It isn't really giving me a sense of what I should do differently, because I've heard that before. It started out well, but I've heard where it came out before. And the question, I think we need to keep thinking to ourselves about how we respond to that. And I don't know if anybody's read this slightly challenging article that Dan Hernig and Lant Pritchett have recently written on account-based versus accounting-based accountability. It's a real tongue twister. But think about it for a minute. Account-based versus accounting-based accountability. And a lot of our systems in IFIs are actually accounting-based. We count things. We count ratings, we count success, completions, whatever. But account-based accountability is a much more holistic assessment of the kind of drivers of good practice. And I think we need to think about the balance between those things.
Thank you. Donald?
So it probably picks up in a more practitioner way where Alison was talking. And it seems to me at the heart of all this issue is the issue of learning versus accountability. And too much of what we've done, I'm not just talking about in IFAD, but in my previous lives, is see evaluation as accountability rather than learning. And I think not often helped, having sat on a number of boards, that the board feels that they need an accountability mechanism. And if we're honest, and I sat on 7 or 8 boards, you're sitting there looking at that accountability rather than saying, but are we really having the best environment for learning lessons here? And actually, we should be about learning. That should be, in many ways, the measure of accountability is we are learning, rather than how many of these recommendations have you implemented and Actually, are you really learning? And I worked a lot with the military, and the military had a really good saying, because we'd sit there and do all these lessons learned exercise, and they'd say, none of this is lessons learned. You're doing lessons identified exercises, because nothing's learned until you actually act upon it, and therefore it has been learned. And I really think we've got to take a fresh look at what does accountability mean in the context of learning. Because if we spend our time focused on the accountability, we won't learn. We've got to get that balance more as a balance. Accountability is important, but as much for learning than as an accountability as an end unto itself.
So what will be the one thing you're going to do to change that?
Continue to engage robustly with IOE and have this debate. But no, I think we also, with the board as well. I mean, I think we have a duty in management to really engage with the board directly on this issue. I think this is where the new evaluation policy is a real opportunity. I think if we make it, one, it has been seen, and some of the language in it is such anyway, it's been seen more as a kind of an independent evaluation policy rather than an evaluation policy for the whole of house, including all the internal self-evaluation aspects. So I think a real win for me is getting it seen as an IFAD evaluation policy rather than IOE evaluation policy. And in that context, I think it opens up a lot more opportunities for learning and also for engagement interaction with the board on the learning, so that we can help the board to understand and embrace and engage in the learning aspects rather than just the accountability aspects of it. And I think, secondly, working towards this new evaluation policy, it should really look at the strategic purpose of evaluation, which for me is around the development effectiveness of the organisation, not around the accountability or learning per se, but are we being more effective? And I think, that again comes back to the balance of accountability and learning. And then I think the third thing in the new policy is to really ensure we're clear on the separate as well as the collective roles and responsibilities of the EB, IOE and management within that policy, because I think sometimes we blur those or we're not clear enough of them.
Okay, thanks for that. Paul, Alison said something. She said, these recommendations are not robust enough so that we're not guiding people so that they change their mind, right? So from where you sit, from a knowledge perspective, what should change so that we actually can change people's mind, or rather not change people's mind, so that they arrive to the conclusion that they should bring about a change?
Well, one is I think what Donald was saying about having an evaluation policy that covers everything, so that you have a culture of learning. And we started this with the Development Effectiveness Framework where an OPR was created and the whole idea of doing that. So I think we've been heading in that direction for a while. It does, the lessons themselves, a part of the benefit of the thematic ones is I think that they're easier to use sometimes because they provide you some broad direction. But the lessons are often, and what you need in the project is how to implement, how to actually do things, very practical things. And the lessons tend not to be around that. And so one of the issues in creating knowledge is not just to have these broad lessons identified, but learned in such a way that you know how to implement them. I think gender is a good example. We know what we need to do to kind of balance the intra-household allocation of resources. And but the challenge we have is figuring out what's the best way actually to do that. The Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank has recently done some work, and a paper's coming out that they told me about ways to actually implement it that have been showing to work. So they've been experimenting with different implementation procedures, and that's extremely valuable. So instead of saying broadly we should do this, it's saying this is actually how you do it. So if we can think very much in terms of what do you need as someone that's designing a project. It's not, broadly I need to invest in irrigation. It's how do I actually invest in irrigation to make it successful? And what's the type of things you can do, and answer those kind of questions a bit more would be helpful.
Okay, so what is it that you would require? How would you require the evaluation findings to change to pave the way forward to what you just explained?
I actually think evaluation findings are usually better at trying to do this compared to, say, general research, et cetera. So sometimes they can do that well, but I really ultimately think a lot of it has to be with an internal M&E system. And this is what I'm getting back to what Donald was saying, is that you learn lessons within the projects, and then you adjust the project based on what you're learning from the M&E system, that this isn't working or could be done differently, because you're learning as you're going on. If you're, in Rwanda, one of the challenges they're facing is how do you manage irrigation systems? And basically they said, sorry, but the World Bank projects aren't working because they're just putting in hardscape and not management systems to go along with the irrigation. And so that's why they want IFAD. And so IFAD has experience of this, but how do you do it actually right in Rwanda? How do you make sure that you're going to set up water use associations that manage it given the Rwandan context? So you need some sort of community organization. You need people to work together. What's the governance structure? There's a whole series of small questions that if you don't set up an M&E system to begin with to answer those, you're not going to answer them properly. So it's part of this overall evaluation strategy to do it within your projects, to have it evaluated by IOE or external evaluators to answer the questions.
Okay, okay. Oscar, you've heard you've heard very many points of view, and one that also struck me was Donald was asking for perhaps, you know, maybe the Office of Evaluation can do more quick and dirty kind of evaluation and the timeliness of it. So if you just want to give us you know, your view on everything that you've heard.
Thank you. Indeed. I think the emphasis on development effectiveness is of paramount importance, right? Because in this debate between accountability and learning, I see it that this type of independent offices like IEG and IOE do report to the member states, and the member states are interested more in accountability than in learning because they invest their money and they want to see the results. That doesn't mean that they are not interested in learning, but their primary objective is to keep this use of public funds accountable for achieving the expected results. And that's where the development effectiveness debate come into play. From a personal point of view, I see accountability and learning as two sides of the same coin. You cannot have an evaluation that is exclusively accountability oriented or exclusively learning oriented. In any evaluation, you will have an amount of accountability and an amount of learning. Now, where do you emphasize and how do you emphasize? It's a different matter, and that can be discussed in terms of how a product mix can really yield those expectations and fulfill those expectations. But in terms of the engagement that you're speaking, I see the need for a closer engagement, and I do look forward to this engagement with Donald and his team as well. I would like to point out to one element of that engagement related to the independence that Alison was referring before, which is the conflict of interest. There is a line in which you cannot be judge and jury. And for me, it is extremely important that evaluators do not engage into the design of a project. They can share really their lessons learned. They can share and help management to see that things that they either did not see before or did not have the time to pay sufficient attention to reflect upon that. And that is why, you know, someone that comes from the outside who has not been engaged into the design or implementation of that particular intervention can help you with. And we hold a mirror for that, you know. But the moment that we start blurring that line in terms of starting designing implementations, in my view, that's the type of engagement that would be going too far and putting in question the principle of independence that is necessary for the credibility and utility. Because from that independence, also the institution benefits. I mean, in terms of having the appropriate checks and balances that can ensure that the resources are spent adequately, right? So all for this new relationship between accountability and learning, and for shortening the feedback loops, and for giving importance to the process and not just to the end product. And I think we have been doing that. We may do it better, right? But it's not a principle that is new to IOE, and we do look forward to that engagement.
Wonderful. Yes, Paul.
I mean, I think this is it's a huge issue, right? Because you also struggle to learn if you're not heavily engaged in a project, which doesn't mean that's your job, but it does make a difference. If you're going to do an ex-ante impact evaluation, you're engaged in the project. In fact, half the time you change the project. Why? Because you go in there and you start telling them, well, if you're going to invest in this and I'm going to check whether it has an impact on income, what you're doing isn't going to have an impact on income. So you need to change what you're doing if that's your objective. And so you end up having this huge impact on what they're doing. You have an effect on the way they roll out the project if you're doing some sort of randomized controlled trial where they're phasing it in. So you do, and that's the best way to learn because you're engaged in it from the very beginning and you're helping and you're working with them. What are the questions you want to answer? So this is a government project. What do you guys want to know? Like I was saying in the Rwanda example, the Minister of Agriculture has hypothesis she wants tested. And so you have to be engaged, and to test those, you can set up a project to do that. I could set up different types of water users associations across my project and then check to see which works. And so you have to be engaged. So there's a trade-off in that way of independence and the ability to learn. And that's fine. As I said, this is part of what I think internal management's responsibility is, to learn from projects. But there's clearly a trade-off there in the learning side of things.
Alison?
I just want to reflect on that because I think you're absolutely right. But one of the problems I have is where we tend to see ex-ante and ex-post evaluation living on different planets. And I think that's really problematic. So why I like this notion of the ecosystem and us kind of inhabiting a common world where we're all interested in and contributing to the development effectiveness of the institution is that we can begin to understand how we do work alongside each other in separate spaces, but essentially acknowledging each other's contribution. And one of the things that we're hoping to do in the World Bank context is just find more effective ways to bridge between ex-ante impact evaluation and the work that we do. So that one, we acknowledge the role it plays upstream, but that we're able to build on it much more effectively downstream, to build on that experience and then also to provide additional ex-post evaluation. So this idea of there being, it's not so much a continuum, but at least we're inhabiting a similar universe, not completely in different planets, which I find, frankly, somewhat problematic for the mission of contributing to development effectiveness. And I think on the point of engagement, Oscar's absolutely right. We have to guard very carefully and seriously against conflict of interest. But I would challenge ourselves in the notion that I sometimes feel that is drawn very, very broadly in order to just sort of to somehow and it's certainly not the case. I'm not relating to any examples here or in the bank particularly, but it's sometimes used as an excuse for not engaging on the grounds that there is potential COI. And I think we need to constantly ask, have we got that right? Because I'm not entirely sure that's always the case. And certainly from my experience with the Committee on Development Effectiveness on the World Bank Board, they're all about learning right now. In fact, they challenge me constantly to say, how do we know if the bank is learning from this? How do you know? How do we know? Tell us how we know, because ultimately that's what we're interested in. So you're right, of course the accountability for public funds is a baseline concern. But their concern is that accountability is in part demonstrated by organizations that are learning about how to do better. Otherwise, accountability becomes static. And that actually isn't the world in which we inhabit. So they are really concerned that all this evaluative evidence, all this research, all this knowledge that they are partly funding is actually influencing the way the organization is operating. Is it influencing the things that it's doing and the way it's doing it? And that's the learning piece. And that's why we absolutely have to put that front and center. So for me, increasingly, accountability includes, it's not so much even the same side of the same coin, it includes a commitment to be evidence-based, to learn from evidence, and to be able to demonstrate results.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to the floor for any questions.
I just wonder whether we
Yes.
Francisco
Yeah. I was going to go to IFAD Panama and Francisco. If you have any questions, why don't you start? Go ahead, Francisco. I think you're on. froze.
Francisco, do you want to speak?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Yes, I think the ultimate test for the evaluation function at IFAD or any institutions is really the impact that IOE has on IFAD's policies and strategies and operations. And I had a question to Oscar. Oscar, what do you consider to be the impact of IOE evaluations in on the way the recent OPEX reforms have been carried out?
Thank you, Francisco. It's a broad question, but let me try to respond to that. I think there are a number of evaluations that were produced by IOE that have impacted, I would expect in a positive way, how IFAD operates. And the first one was really related to direct supervision. Before, you may remember that IFAD did not undertake direct supervision. And that provided a qualitatively completely different approach to development, enhancing the possibility to have a broader impact as an organization. By the same token, I would say the evaluation on efficiency was another corporate level evaluation that influenced positively, identifying many of the challenges that we have of operating in remote areas in the rural context in developing countries. In the last period of time, I would say that our corporate level evaluations on decentralization, to respond directly to your question, has also made an important contribution to bring closer our operations to the needs of our member states by furthering, strengthening our country presence, and by establishing a more direct responsiveness capacity in our country offices and sub-regional hubs. And so I could go with another few examples, including the one on financial architecture, but for that perhaps it's too early to see really important changes. But I know that IFAD management is embarking into what is called now IFAD 2.0, based in a significant manner in some of the inputs coming from this evaluative work. Yeah, let me stop there.
Thank you. Francisco, do you have any other questions for the other panelists?
No, thank you very much, Rosie.
Okay, dear, thank you. To the room here, any questions? Yes, yes.
Hi, thank you very much for, I'll just stand because, thank you very much for the discussion so far. While I was listening to the panelists, you know, throughout the discussion, I think at a certain point we kept going back to references to the committee, to the board, and it almost, you know, feels like both management and for evaluation, I think in some ways the most direct or the first point of contact or our clients' first clients happen to be the governing bodies. So if that is indeed the case, and for evaluation as well, as Oscar himself has acknowledged, that we do report to the committee and the board. So if the board happens to be our first point of contact when it comes to evaluations, after the evaluation process has concluded, why should we restrict the evaluation policy to the PMD and evaluation? Why not then have the governing bodies as well encompassed in it? Because ultimately, if the change has to, if the change has to be brought about by bringing about a certain change in the way evaluations looked at by the governing bodies, then I think they should be a part of it as well. But this is a more overarching point rather than something specific. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And there is, yes, it will come. Okay, and then there is, yeah.
Okay, thank you. The discussion have moved to the issue of accountability versus learning. And when Paul started to present his point, he mentioned 3 pillars in IFAD, which is research, monitoring and evaluation, self-monitoring and evaluation. So I want the panelists to tell what have been the contribution of those 3 different pillars in terms of learning, but also in terms of accountability, and how this can be used to strengthen those 2 functions. It is key, it is important, but not only to see evaluation contributing to that factors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then there's one question. Yeah. Oh, okay.
I want to see some points of agreement here, and I think all the speakers agree to the idea that there should be a culture of results that we work towards in order to achieve development effectiveness, whether it is emphasis on learning or whether it is emphasis on willingness to adapt new programs reflecting on the results and so on and so forth. We can talk about culture of results. And I do think evaluation policy is not entirely portable, but it depends on the particular organization's level of culture of results, how advanced we are, how entrenched we are in recognizing what should be the coverage, what should be the timeliness, how much resources we are willing to put in evaluations, and how much we are willingness to emphasize the roles and responsibilities of different organizations. Different units of the organization. And I fully agree that any evaluation policy, by definition, is not just an independent office evaluation policy, but the policy of the whole organization. That is a given, that what each unit can contribute to strengthening how we design and use and produce evaluations, right? In that sense, even monitoring could be part of what is a contributing element to the evaluations. My question to all the panelists is, how in this particular, if you understand culture of results as this internalization of the need to cover, to time, to dedicate resources, to willingness to learn from evaluations, how advanced are we or how behind are we in this particular situation, and what we need to do reflect in our evaluation policy to strengthen this culture of results? If incentives are not an option, but through the policy, what kind of things we can do to entrench or enhance the culture of results? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Paolo?
Well, thank you for the discussion. Thinking of the accountability versus learning gap or trade-off as it's sometimes perceived, it reminded me of an evaluation tool we used to have a number of years ago here at IFAD, and I'm sure in other institutions as well, which were the so-called ex-post evaluations. And that is evaluation processes that would take place a few years after a project would close. And that is perhaps, it was a particularly challenging exercise because in many cases you wouldn't find much evidence of a project after 4 or 5 years after closure. But at the same time, it was, when you did find evidence, it was an opportunity to ensure that both accountability and learning on sustainability would be served. And then at some point in time, here at IFAD, ex-post evaluation started being called post-mortem evaluations, and after that, they were discontinued.
They died.
I wonder if perhaps at the bank or also in Oscar's views, what is your appreciation of ex-post evaluation and their potential role in serving both purposes of accountability and learning? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Donald, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I'll be quick because I know we're trying to wrap up. I think obviously the board have a role to play in this evaluation policy. That's why we're working with the evaluation committee on it. Just 2 things, I think. Ensuring there's a culture, as Paul said earlier on, of use of evidence. I think, and just continuing to reinforce that need and asking the questions. And I think we in senior management have a duty in that context to really sort of say, you know, to really say where's the evidence, ensure that we're seen to be using evidence. Secondly, I think there's a gap in IFAD in this area. It's the only organisation I've come across which has no real specialist M&E people in the organisation outside of RIA. Every other organisation I've been in, you know, and I think we could do with trying to professionalise M&E a bit more within the organisation. You know, a lot of us are practitioners and do it, but you know, other organisations I've worked with or been on boards of have much more of an M&E functional people that get accredited to it, so you can professionalise a bit more, and it's not just practitioners of. And I think there's probably more we could do here on actually trying to build up a sort of a specialism of M&E, even if it's within the overall cadre of people. Thank you.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, so building off that, I think Donald's right. I mean, the people in RIA are focused on impact, not on the whole M&E process. And that is something that could be strengthened. And I think it has, and we shouldn't forget that we have made a lot of progress. I mean, OPR didn't exist a few years ago, and it was something that was done by the front office of PMD, but not as systematically as it is right now. So I think there's been a big push to better data, to better M&E, but it needs to continue in the manner that Donald was talking about. In terms of the question on the research M&E, and evaluation, I think that research has been very helpful in our broader direction a lot. I mean, the fact that IFAD has moved into value chains, has recognized, you know, 70% of projects, is because there's literature out there that showed how important that was, experience showed how important that was, and we moved in that way. And there's a lot of the broader directions that we take that are based on what is out there in terms of evidence and is going on. What we could probably do better at is actually at the project level is what is evidence from research, from evaluation, M&E in general. And what Donald was saying earlier about, you know, thinking in terms of multiple projects and going over time and learning as you go along and then adjusting and bringing in evidence from the outside, I think it would be a good way forward to create a culture of learning to come to some of these other questions. So I do think that would help us answer the question about, you know, creating this culture of learning is strengthening the M&E within the projects and people thinking in those terms as they're designing the projects.
Okay, Alison?
Okay, I'm going to pitch in on that challenging question about where are we in relation to the results agenda and how far have we come, how far have we to go. I think we have come some distance, there's no question. I think we have a lot of the kind of formal trappings of a results capture system in many of our organizations. We have scorecards, we have more ways of sort of adding up results at different levels of the organization. But I still feel that, you know, what we haven't necessarily got is we haven't got all the hearts and minds of our organizations completely pulling in behind that. So some of the things that, you know, I would still like to see happen at a number of levels in the World Bank Group is, and it really does start from the top, I would like to see board members whipping out their 5 top, you know, lessons from recent IEG evaluations in the way they dialogue and discharge their oversight at the bank's board. At the moment, their advisors spend hours going through our evaluations trying to find material that they can build on. It's a very lengthy exercise. I would like to think we've got something much more ready-made that they can build on and use in exchanges with management at the board on a regular basis. I would like to think that country directors regularly look to the evidence base that is contained within research and evaluation when dialoguing with clients, when looking to shape country programs and thinking about not just how to do things, but what are the right things to do. And I think we should be moving much more assertively in that, and how to get beyond these generic lessons, I think, is important for that. Task team leaders, which are, you know, project leaders in the bank, using evaluation as a critical source of evidence, along with research, along both internal and external, to select, design, and adapt operations. That's the how to do things right. And then also a knowledge management system that can package knowledge, be it evaluative, be it research-based, in a way that is timely and accessible. Now, we have some of all of those elements, but they're not all pulling together. They're not pulling together in one direction. And as I say, I don't think we've got all the hearts and minds. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done. One of the things that occurs to me about sort of evaluation policy, I mean, I think if we'd been starting one now and thinking about what we'd like to include, a lot of what's in there would be absolutely essential for the document. But I think I'd want to situate it also within the idea of an evidence cycle, so that we really try to understand how evaluation comes together within an evidence cycle to inform the results agenda and development effectiveness. And I think that would be quite an interesting way of threading together the role that evaluation of all kinds, independent and otherwise, and research can make to doing better. Really.
Thank you for that. That's a fascinating concept, the evidence cycle. Oscar?
Yes, let me start by answering the question posed by Paolo. And indeed, I think particularly in the field of rural development, we need to see the effects and the impact of our interventions in the long term, not just immediately when the project has closed. Actually, that was many years back one of the definitions of impact evaluation, that you do it when you can see the impact and not before, right? But we have moved a bit away from that. However, I'm open to that idea, because even more now that IFAD management has put some emphasis on the importance of developing exit strategies, right? So that the benefits of a given intervention could be sustainable. And in that sense, I think it could be a healthy addition to our thinking. Now, in terms of the culture of results and the role that this new evaluation policy can play, I think it's extremely important, because in addition to the principles that will be shared and discussed and embedded and more broadly disseminated, the evaluation policy is also helpful in clarifying roles and responsibilities, right? And in those roles and responsibilities, we could get a dent into really how can we create such an incentive system that for the use of the evidence coming from evaluative work, from monitoring work, from research, and so on. But let us, in that context, understand that, and building on the experience of the World Bank, that they are trying to see how the World Bank learns, right? Therefore, from the IOE perspective, we will be one of the contributors to how IFAD learns, right? But the responsibility for learning goes clearly beyond the Independent Office of Evaluation. It really goes to management and our board, you know, to internalize the lessons from our experience, so that we can be able to leverage that experience for a broader impact on the ground.
Very good. It's past 4 o'clock, so I want to thank everybody for their time. But before everybody starts to leave, I know Donald has to rush off. Just a 30-second response from all of you. What is the one thing that will make the revised IFAD evaluation stand out amongst and between its competitors and comparators?
Do you want to kick off, Paul?
Well, I'd just say that whether it stands out or not, it needs to bring together these different elements into an evidence cycle in which all the players within that cycle are working together. So the M&E part, the evaluation part, the research part, and it should be to ultimately achieve effective development. It might be easier for us to do that because we're a small organization. And so that's one advantage that we have, and we can try to work together on that. But I think ultimately that's what we're after.
Okay.
So I don't know whether it would stand out into comparator organizations, but I think an evaluation policy that really is a joint evaluation policy coming from where we've been before would certainly be a big step forward. I think, secondly, that it's an evaluation policy which focuses on strengthening the issues that we've talked about cultures and behaviour for all people, not just management, not just IOE, but also for the board. So it really truly looks at that culture and behaviours, and particularly for me around learning. And I think a policy that, I think as Alison said maybe early on, that's flexible enough to allow us to innovate and move beyond a sort of a framework, which means we can't change, because this is going to be setting the direction for us really to reach the SDGs. There ain't going to be much else before then. So we don't need to come back and keep revising the evaluation policy every time we've got a good idea of how to make things better.
Okay. Oscar?
I view the process will be as rich as the end product, right? And therefore, I do look forward to a very fruitful and constructive interaction with the various stakeholders for that. And hopefully, the process and the product will be short, so that both can be internalized more easily by the different stakeholders.
Very good. And Alison?
Well, I agree with all of that. I think we're actually of one mind, but I would say I hope it's an opportunity, not a burden.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. And thank you. Good.
Alison, thank you
Yeah,
so much.
that's all right. It was okay. Good luck.